A year before Milton Friedman passed away, I had the chance to sit down with him in San Francisco for an extended conversation. Friedman was one of the great economic minds of all time. He not only won a Nobel Prize, but I think in the pantheon of economic thinkers, he certainly would be considered by many to be up there with Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes and Joseph Schumpeter, David Ricardo, and others. Very importantly, he was an American product, and perhaps the greatest economic thinker that really took root in American soil and helped us understand the limitations and potential of monetary policy, some of the dangers of the fiscal side of the equation, and the incredible entrepreneurial genius that's now being expressed through globalization. This is an important interview because of the anxiety that we're experiencing with regards to forces of globalization, concern about the direction and fate of the United States economy, and a general angst about where we're headed. And I think Milton Friedman addresses these various issues in only the way that Milton Friedman could, with a good sense of humor, but with a clarity of expression that is remarkable. I hope you'll find this conversation informative and enlightening. You realize that you're the patron saint of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank.
Well, that's a position for me to be in, given that most of my life I've been regarded as the chief enemy of the Federal Reserve System.
Well, I didn't want to make you feel uncomfortable with that statement, but we admire your work.
Delighted to be there.
Your seminal work, Free to Choose, has had such a mark on policy development and on society generally. I'd like to revisit that, if I may, in this discussion. You wrote that in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we had this titanic struggle between the capitalists and the communists. We had the Soviet Union in place. The Berlin Wall was still standing. We had a very different kind of China than we appear to have presently. And I'm curious, in your mind, Dr. Friedman, today, where is the battleground for ideas?
The battleground for ideas is where it has always been, in the minds of people in the United States, Britain, and the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. But the place where you have had the major changes since then has been not in the United States, not in what's known as the West, but in the former Soviet Union, in China, and in East Asia. Mm. That's where practice has been changing, and that we hope, believe.
Now, why did that happen? Was it good luck? Was it good ideas?
It had two components. Mm-hmm. Over the course of time, there had been developing increasing public understanding that socialism was not an appropriate way to run a country. You know, socialism used to be, the classic definition of socialism was the ownership and operation of the means of production. I doubt that anybody today would regard that kind of socialism as a viable way to run a country. What brought about that change in recognition was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that really was as strong a demonstration as you could have of the fact that a totalitarian state controlled from the center was not an efficient way to run a country, and was certainly not a way that was consistent with human freedom.
So now today we have some new competitors in the system. You mentioned Russia.
Not new competitors. We have new resources, new cooperators. In the last 20 years, there's been an enormous increase. There's been an enormous increase in the number of laborers available for cooperation with capital through private enterprise means. And that's what's happening in Asia, in India, and in much of the former Soviet Union.
So now we have significant competition.
We have significant cooperation.
And cooperation.
We have new resources to use.
And we have new resources to which to resort to comparative advantage.
That's right. You say new competition, but it seems to me what really characterizes the world is less competition than cooperation. The really remarkable thing about the world is how people cooperate together, how somebody in China makes a little bit of your television set, or somebody in Malaysia produces some rubber, and that rubber is used by somebody in the United States to put on the tip of a pencil or in some other way. So cooperation, what has happened, has been an enormous expansion in the opportunities for cooperation.
And do you think this is why the United States has been growing and the business cycle appears to have become somewhat elongated?
No, I don't. I think it's partly why we're growing, but not why the business cycle appears to have become elongated. I don't really believe that. I never really believed in a business cycle that as something that's inherent and regularly like the yearly cycle. I think what you have is a world or an economy which is continuously being hit by shocks, things that come along that disturb it. And the whole problem is how you adapt to shocks. Now, for most, there has been a big change in that respect. Up until about 1982 or 3, around that, the economy was unstable. Price level was going up and going down, going up and down. You had an unstable economy. That was what gave the myth of the business cycle. Now, since 1983 or 4 or so, we seem to have a very stable world. If you plot such a thing as a price level, before 1984 it goes like that, and then after 84 it goes like almost a straight line. There's still some fluctuations, but much less. And I think the answer is that the Federal Reserve has stopped messing things up.
Thank you.
For the first 70 years or so of its existence, the Federal Reserve, in my opinion, that's why I said what I said earlier, the Federal Reserve, in my opinion, did vastly more harm than good. I do not believe we would have had the Great Depression if the Federal Reserve had never been established. But since the 80s, since Volcker and Greenspan, with the backing of Reagan, ended inflation and adopted the policy that their primary goal was to maintain stable prices. And since not only the United States, but other countries in the world did the same thing. You had in New Zealand, which had the same bad pattern before, about 1985 or so. And it established a central bank contract in which the governor of the central bank would be fired if inflation got above 2% a year.
That was really putting it on the line.
Don Brash,
That's right.
who was a governor of the central bank, really put himself on the line. And lo and behold, he was able to do it. And he then started what became known as inflation targeting. Other central banks around the world did the same. Australia, Great Britain, and essentially the European Central Bank. And lo and behold, all of them could do it. So I think that what has happened, the explanation for what you're describing as a lengthened out business cycle, the explanation for that is the conversion of the central banks of the world to the belief that their fundamental task was price stability.
And as a result, we've had a convergence of lower rates of inflation and lower interest rates around the world.
Right.
At the same time that we have new cooperators, which some people would refer to as new competitors, coming into the system. So we have, as you mentioned earlier, a huge population mass, 1.3 billion Chinese, maybe 700 million plus that are of working age. We have the Indians, and we have then little countries like Estonia and others now eager to compete and eager to be free to choose as people. Should Americans be worried about this?
Oh, quite the opposite. We should applaud it. We should try to make it more rapidly. Again, it gives us an opportunity to make more use of our own special advantages.
And
We have nothing to be afraid of from cooperating with the great mass of the world's population, but everything to gain from it.
one of the key points you've made throughout your distinguished career is not only taking Adam Smith, but also Thomas Jefferson, and talking about political freedom as well,
Yeah.
and a government that is the least intrusive in our society. It's the invisible hand go to work. How will this resolve itself in China? Here we have a society that is liberalizing since Deng Xiaoping started the program in '79 or so, has continued to grow economically, but still has a communist centralized government. I'm curious as to how you see this resolving itself over time.
I think it must resolve itself with the conflict between the economic world and the political world. I do not believe that China can continue to move as it has been moving in expanding the range of the market, and at the same time continue with its wholly, fully centralized government. I think Tiananmen Square was the first episode of the kind. It was the first conflict. Now, let me emphasize that there has been considerable increase, not political freedom, but civil freedom. I decided basically by experience with Hong Kong that it was important to separate to distinct categories of freedom. Economic freedom, the freedom to buy and sell, to make transactions. Civil freedom, the freedom to speak freely, the freedom to write and have freedom of speech, and then political freedom, which was the freedom to elect your leaders. Hong Kong, under the British, had complete civil freedom and complete economic freedom, 100%, had zero political freedom because of the British.
Right.
Well, the British were the dictators.
Right.
But the citizens of Hong Kong could not vote for anything. And that demonstrates that these are separable. In its essence, what it says is, in principle, you can have a benevolent dictator. I say in principle because in practice, you can have one, but it won't last because he won't stay benevolent. Right. At any rate, if we come to the Chinese situation, there has a big improvement in civil freedom in the mainland China now. I first visited China in 1980, just at the time of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And there was a tremendous, and I've visited it twice since, and there's no question about the increase in economic prosperity, but there's also no question about the belief in civil freedom, in the willingness of people to sleep, in the way in which they're willing to depart from customs, to wear bright clothes instead of the standard Mao jacket,
That's right.
and so on. And it's my opinion that that has to continue, that political freedom will result from economic freedom, or else economic freedom will be terminated.
Well, in the meantime, of course, China has been growing at a pretty fast clip. As Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catching mice in droves. India now seems to be getting on the stick.
Right.
There's a different set of rules in India. There is a rule of law in India. And I know you believe in the rule of law. I'm curious, what is the role of government in those societies? What would you think is the role of government? What should be the ideal role of government in these countries as they're making this transition?
I'm not sure whether you're asking the question, what is the role of government they ought to aim at, or what is the role of government during the transition?
Well, let's start with what they would aim at, but how do they get there?
There's no formula for how to get there, I am afraid. But I have no doubt what they should aim at. And exactly the same thing that we should aim at. I think the appropriate role of government is not very different anywhere around the world. They should aim at first the first role of government is to defend the nation against foreign threats. So every government has to have a defense. They should aim, the second role of government is to protect private individuals from coercion and from violence.
So there's a law enforcement role.
Law enforcement role. Well, the third role of government is to set the law, to set the rules. For example, here, if a plane flies over your house, is he violating your property rights? Well, if he flies at 10 feet over your house, at 1,000 feet over your house, at 10 miles over your house, 100 miles over your house, clearly there is no obvious breaking point. And one of the roles important roles of government is to set the rules for cases like that, to specify what are property rights. Another function of government, or the same function of government, is to protect those property rights, to protect transactions between individuals that are made in good faith. And that's about the end of it.
So the methods of transitions differ, but while these transitions are taking place and these new cooperators are in the system, there are some other governments that we are used to as Western societies that are coming under enormous pressure to change. We just have witnessed an election in Germany, for example, and I'm curious as to your views as to how some of these less flexible societies, if that's what they are, now adapt to the competitive pressure that's coming from this liberalization of Chinese economic activity.
Well, you know, in a way, New Zealand that we were talking about earlier,
yes,
it gives you a very good example. Here you had a conservative party in New Zealand that tied it all up, imposed price controls, imposed exchange control, imposed wage controls, had a highly regulated, really one of the most regulated welfare states. And a new government came in, a labor government as it happened, which completely reversed all of those. It set the exchange rate free, it established the new bank arrangements, it eliminated wage and price control, it even eliminated a large part of government management and ownership of the schools. And it did that entirely in democratic process, not with any force. That's I think the example that you'd like to see repeated. Here is Germany. It's in a very difficult situation because by this time, probably close to half of the public, if not more than half, depends in large part on payments from the government. And they obviously don't want those changed.
nobody wants to give something up.
Nobody wants to give something up. And yet, somehow or other, everybody has to give something up if they're going to have a better country. Here's Germany. Its people are hard workers. They've demonstrated in the past that they are highly productive people. They are a model from that point of view. And they started after World War II in what looked like a very good direction. But then they got driven off the right path by the problems that arose with unification of East and West Germany. I believe their current difficulties derive from three factors. First, when they went into the euro, I believe they went in at an exchange rate that overvalued the mark. Second, going back earlier, when they unified, they made a major mistake of equating the East German and the West German mark on a one-to-one basis, which grossly overvalued East German wages, East German costs. And third, they have adopted a great, an unreal amount of regulation and restrictions. And the only way they can straighten out things is to eliminate some of those problems. I don't see much chance of their doing so soon. So the prospect does not look very good. But it turns out that those are the circumstances which sooner or later give rise to a real movement for change. But I don't have magic formula about how to break up that kind of a situation. And that the situation in different countries is different. That's Germany. It's altogether different from the situation, let's say, of India. India is a country which has, from the political point of view, it is a democracy, and it has a legal system and a rule of law, but it has been a country of castes and of high restrictions, of government controls. It's been a socialist country. It's Indians who move out of India and go anywhere in the world do very well, whether they're in Silicon Valley or whether they're in Africa. But within India, in the past, they've been hamstrung because of a socialist government. And now that's changing, breaking up. And India is moving very rapidly. But we must remember that both India and China are still very poor countries. And as such, they have lots of room to grow, and lots of room to grow. And in the process, both of them are going to increase the extent of both civil freedom and political freedom.
So this process of becoming free to choose works, it's magic, not just on the economy, but also on the politics.
I think that's right. I think choice has enormous power. You just compare how somebody spends his own money and how he spends somebody else's money.
Well, I bet you he'll do a better job spending his own money.
You don't have to bet on that.
Let's talk about spending money for a minute. Some people posit that as we move towards greater cooperation / competition in the world at large, that in order to stay ahead of the game, and we are the biggest economy in the world, we produce $12 trillion or so of output, and we have been growing, whereas the Europeans have not, for example. We have to become more and more flexible and reduce the barriers to competition, which is healthy in the United States and around the world. Some would posit that not only does this force or keep the central banks doing what you described so beautifully before, that is, providing conditions to keep interest rates low and stable policy, but it also has impacts on the fiscal side. That is, we all are trying to attract as much capital as possible to build our societies and keep our businesses humming. Argue that it forces a discipline of lower and lower, more simplified taxation, so that on that side of the equation there's less interference in society. Would you accept that doctrine?
I would accept that it's highly desirable to have lower taxation and to have flatter rates. But whether it's being forced by the change, I don't know. What I do know is that the real problem, there seems to me is on the spending side.
Interesting.
That as government has increased spending, we make ourselves a less attractive society in which to set up businesses, in which to run businesses. If you look at one of the things that has happened in Germany, it's a number of German companies that have been moving their production and their activities outside the country.
Even to Poland, which irritates some Germans. That's right.
Even to Poland.
Right.
Well, Poland has been doing much better.
Exactly.
Because Poland has been moving away. It's been opening up the economy rather than closing it down. Whereas what Germany has been doing is to close down the economy. So I would say that the global world of free trade, the best thing we in the United States could do, there's no question in my mind, would be unilateral free trade. We have nothing to lose by trading freely with every other place in the world.
Well, we have, of course, had a series of rounds of trade negotiation. It's gotten better and better, but it's imperfect as it now exists. We know that.
Well, I tell you.
But coming back, I'd just like to come back to complete, if we can, Dr. Friedman, this discussion of spending. Question. When government spends money, and you defined earlier the limited areas where at least they have to spend money, defense, enforcing the law, and so on, will this new cooperation, new competition force a difference in the composition of spending? Can we continue to spend on entitlements, for example, as opposed to improving our educational plant or
Well, we
assisting
should
in
not.
research, or involved in that at all?
We shouldn't have been involved in that at all,
Right.
independently of the international trade.
Mm-hmm.
But it is true that after all, the countries are going to compare one with the other.
Mm-hmm.
And most countries in the world spend as large as we spend roughly close to 40% of our national income through government.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very high number, but it's lower than what's true for all of the European countries. It's lower than what's true for many countries in the world. And so as long as we're not higher than other countries, we can get along with it.
Comparatively.
Comparatively. But we would be much better off if we could cut down that spending. You say entitlements, but it's not clear. Most entitlements, in my opinion, are not justified. They do not serve a useful function. Take Social Security for a moment. What Social Security Ponzi game, people come in and put money into a pot. People go out and take the money out of the pot. And the whole thing is dependent on new entrants coming in and feeding that pot.
Right.
The money is not invested. The money that comes in, the government spends routinely. It does not accumulate any assets. It's interesting. Everybody talks about how aging of the population is raising difficulties for Social Security. I haven't heard anybody ask, well, why don't they raise difficulties for life insurance companies?
Interesting.
It doesn't, because the aging of the population means that life insurance companies have larger reserves, because older people have bought in their youth insurance, and it's in the insurance companies.
So those are real trust funds. In other words,
Those are real
properly
trust
managed asset
Right.
bases.
Whereas the Social Security is, as I say, a Ponzi game. It's taking money from some and giving it to others. And that's not a stable situation.
Well, we have then an existing liability there for our government.
We have an existing liability, and we ought to live up to it. We ought to pay it off. My favorite solution, utterly not politically feasible, would be to give every individual who's in Social Security system now, either as a recipient or as a payer, bonds equal to the present value of what they so far have actuarially earned, and then close the whole system down.
Well, then you'd have to explain present value to the public, which is never an easy task.
Oh, I think the public understands present value.
Right.
It may not know the formulae.
Right. Well, they understand value. We know
Yes.
that. If we could just come back to this issue, because you were saying that spending is a critical issue, and obviously indiscriminate spending can scare away those we're trying to attract capital from. Do you worry about the fiscal deficits that we now have in this country that have been accumulating over time?
The problem is not that. The problem is the spending. Consider the two following. Which would you rather have? Government spending of on anything of $10 billion, completely paid for by taxes, or government spending of $5 billion, completely paid for by borrowing?
What's your answer to that question?
Well, I'd rather have $5 billion spending paid for by borrowing.
Right.
What matters is not whether he that pays it is borrowed or taxed, but whether the spending takes place. What really uses up resources is the spending. In fact, borrowing and taxing are really two different forms of taxation. The borrowing is an indirect form of taxation. Obviously, it would be better than either of those to have $5 billion covered by taxes. But you have to keep your eye on the real problem. And the real problem is, and one of the reasons I have always been in favor of tax cuts is because it seemed to be the only way that you can keep down government spending.
Do you think that has worked?
I think that has worked. Not completely, not 100%, but I think it has worked. I think that if we had not had those tax cuts, government spending today would be higher than it is. The Bush administration, by my views, has been entirely too spendthrift. Government has been going up at, I think, about a 17% per year rate in the Bush administration. And there's no justification for that. The military accounts for a very small part of it. But it's incredibly absurd that we still subsidize farmers. We just passed a $3 billion subsidization bill for farmers. That ought to be abolished. There's no excuse for it whatsoever.
And do you hold out any hope or prospect for trade negotiation be a vehicle on this farm issue? There's currently an attempt, as you know, to liberalize. It's called the built-in agenda. Built in because no one's been able to deal with it within the WTO. Is that the avenue through which
I don't
we
think
go?
so. I know only recently somebody asked me to write a letter or a statement in support of the recent trade bill with the
CAFTA?
CAFTA.
Central
CAFTA.
American Free for our viewers, yes.
And so I decided I would look up the CAFTA bill. And no one who read that bill could be in favor of it.
Only you would read the bill, by the way. It's a long piece of paper.
It's a very long paper,
Right.
1,000 pages. You get free trade on 1,000 pages? It's 1,000 pages of rules and regulation.
Interesting.
It's the opposite of free trade. I think that the only way in which we're ever going to achieve free trade is by unilateral action.
This is what the Chileans did, of course, and did
Yes.
so well. Their own import tariffs and the non-tariff barriers unilaterally, did they not?
And that worked very well. It altered their economic state. They became, from a stagnant society, they became a very dynamic society.
And yet,
we would benefit the same way.
well, right now, in terms of agriculture, if we could just stick with that for a second, our societies do subsidize our farmers. The degree to which they do so varies country by country. One of the key issues now is, of course, Europeans so heavily subsidize their farm communities. And this is part of the negotiation.
If they want to waste their money, why should it bother us? And in particular, if they waste their money in a way which benefits us, if they make their agricultural products cheaper to us, why should we refuse the gift? We think it's okay for us to give foreign aid. Isn't it okay for us to receive foreign aid? You should regard foreign subsidization as a form of foreign aid.
Dr. Friedman is eloquent as Winston Churchill, who used to say the same thing. He would say, let someone else cheat their taxpayers. We'll take advantage of it, take the inputs, add value, and sell it at a higher profit.
Right.
The system doesn't quite allow us to do that, but I think that's an incredible statement that you just made. And by the way, you have distinguished company in Churchill and others.
Oh, I should say. When you try to do this by negotiation, you end up with those 1,000-page documents. Because what do you negotiate? What is there to negotiate? We're hurting ourselves. You know, somehow, if you look at it in the broad sense, you have people saying, we are hurting ourselves, they are hurting themselves. Therefore, we have to negotiate about how we reduce that hurt.
To hurt ourselves least, but not eliminate the hurt, is your point.
Well, we're going to do, no, we're not going to eliminate the hurt. We're going to make it worse.
We've had many shocks to our system in recent history. We had the September strikes of 2001. We've had natural disasters. We've had energy price developments, at least that increased the volatility, if not the direction of prices. And we had a huge stock market reversal based on the popping of what some call the dot-com bubble. And yet throughout this, we continue to increase our productivity. Why is that?
We've been remarkably flexible I think the performance of the American economy over the past 10 years, particularly over the period since
Right.
the economy has behaved remarkably well. It's been fluid, it's been adjustable, and I think a very important part of credit for that does go, in this case, to the Federal Reserve and to the stable monetary policy.
You don't have to say that, by the way.
I know I don't have to say that. I have not been a
I know. You've been a constructive critic.
I've not been afraid to criticize where I thought it deserved criticism. But once adopted the view that its fundamental objective was to maintain stable prices.
Right.
The Fed has been able to do so. And over the period from about the 90 to now, you've had close to stable prices.
Mm-hmm.
Been about 2 or 3% inflation, on and off, up and down a little, but very little. Mm-hmm. And that has provided a stable background, which has facilitated the adjustment to these other changes that have come along. So that what you have is not only has there been greater price stability, but there has been greater stability of the economy. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. The accepted doctrine, there's no question, the accepted doctrine among monetary economists was that there was a trade-off between price stability and economic stability. That in order to get greater stability of the economy, you had to have more instability in prices, because you had to use ups in prices or downs in prices to keep the economy straight.
But it's the opposite.
And that has turned out to be false.
Right.
It's just the opposite. The stability of prices facilitate the stability in economic output. And I think that's a major explanation at the moment. So that it's been a very satisfactory period. And productivity has been running high since about the late 80s. And why? Who knows? But surely it has something to do with the great developments in telecommunications in the area. We've had a whole new universe opened up. The character of business has changed in the sense that with the improvements in communication and in movement, traffic seems to be much cheaper now. Mm-hmm. What you have is that companies, instead of having a factory in the United States where they produce something, to produce on the basis of using stuff from all over the world.
Of comparative advantage.
They're become what somebody has called platform companies.
Right.
That a company will pick one part out in China, another part out in India, another part out somewhere else, and then maybe have a plant in Guatemala which will assemble all of these into a product which they can then sell on the market and which they can sell abroad as well. So that manufacturing, in the old sense, has become a much smaller part of the total business. The development of in-time inventories has played a big role in this, because it's reduced the amount of capital that has to be tied up while you're producing it. And all of those things have been very beneficial. So they have led us, it's a curious situation. You read the newspapers and you think the world is going to hell. You think the economy is doing badly. And yet the truth is that we have never in our history had as productive an economy as right now. That average per capita real income is higher now than it had ever been.
And continues to grow.
That's right.
Well, let's take these pieces and put it together. You kindly made the point that the central bank has behaved itself, so that business decision makers, the men who run businesses, aren't distracted by having to worry about price volatility. They focus on their businesses. They have better options in terms of sourcing. They can go to any platform anywhere in the world and increase their efficiency, drive down their costs, raise their profits, make new markets. How do we answer those that say, well, that's wonderful conceptually, and indeed you point to some very powerful numbers, but my job is threatened. And we're losing jobs to Bangalore in India, or to Estonia, or to the Philippines, or Indonesia, or Mexico, or Guatemala, as you referenced.
Well,
How do we, why aren't we able to convince people so easily?
Everybody always takes something good that happened to him as his proper due, and always regards something bad that happened to him as some evil person doing something to him. So there's no way you can get around that. And somehow we simply have to let people observe with their own eyes what the balance of effects is. And the balance of effects clearly is that people today can consume goods and services they could not possibly have consumed 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. That they, a larger fraction of the population own their homes than have ever owned their own home. We go down after another. And on every side, what we've got is incredible progress. Now, you say people are worried about losing their jobs. We aren't losing our jobs. What we're doing is relieving the American workers so they can be used in what they do best. Suppose nobody ever lost a job. How would you get progress?
I agree.
When the United States was established, there were 19 people were in agriculture to every one person in other activities. It took 19 people to raise enough food for themselves and the other one. Now there are, I think, about 1 or 2% of the population in agriculture, and they raise enough food not only for everybody in the United States, but also to have large exports around the world. Now, suppose we had never disturbed anybody in agriculture. Where would we have manpower to build automobiles, to build airplanes, to build telephones and telegrams?
You and I wouldn't be on television because there would be no television.
There'd be no television, that's for sure. So the right way to look at it, as I see it, is that what we're doing is not losing jobs. We're making opportunities for our people, for people in the United States, to use their skills in the most effective way by enabling them to combine more effectively with other people.
Now let me ask you a question about that. Obviously education plays a role. What is the role of education, and should government play a role in financing education if that's the key to our continuing to adapt and move up the ladder?
Education plays a very big role, and it's one of the areas in which we're most deficient. And we're deficient for a very simple reason. We have a socialist educational system, our elementary and secondary system. 87%, 85 to 90% of the kids government schools. And the reason for that is obvious. Government says to children, we'll give you schooling for free. If you want to go into the business of providing schooling, setting up a school, you've got to sell something that somebody down the street is giving away free. And that's not an easy thing to do. Now, that would be okay if those schools were providing real good education, but those schools are not. Literacy today in the United States is probably lower than years ago, and functional literacy even lower. A third of our children never graduate from high school.
It's an amazing statistic.
It's a terrible statistic.
Right.
And the other 2/3 aren't very well educated in many cases. And that's because, as I say, you have a government system, and government, we know government produces anything very badly, very badly. Now, there is an argument, education is enormously important. There is a case for government concern with education. But there is no case for government producing education. There is a case for government financing education. I say there's a case. That doesn't mean I think it's a decisive case. In my ideal world, government would not finance education. Parents would finance the schooling of their own children at their own expense, the same way they finance their food and their clothing and their housing. And government's role, if any, would be only to step in case of indigent children whose parents could not afford to send them to school. But the way the situation is now, government does two things. It does really three things. One, it has compulsory education, compels children to go to school. Number two, it finances the schooling. And number three, it does so by producing schooling. Now, if the government is going to finance something, it can either finance the producer of that thing, or it can finance a consumer of that thing. It has food stamps. It could finance the food stamps by having grocery stores and requiring food stamp people to get their foods in the government grocery store.
Which it does not do. Mm-hmm.
That would not be a very good grocery store. Mm-hmm. Instead, it now gives them stamps and lets them spend it, and they compete for the better food product. In the same way, the right way for government to finance education would be to finance the students, not the schools, to give each parent a voucher which could be used for full tuition in government schools, and for a definite sum of money, I would say about half of what the government now spends per school child in the private market.
So they would be free to choose.
They would be free to
where
choose.
They would be educated.
And you would have a new industry develop, and you would have the ingenuity and productivity of the private market at work in the educational sphere. I don't know what would happen in that. There's no reason why should it be sensible for children to get all of their schooling in one brick building. Maybe a better way to do it is partly over the internet, maybe one piece here, one piece there, I don't know. But give the market a chance, and the market would produce something different than what we now have, and it's better than what we now have.
Well, let me ask you about higher education. One of the concerns you hear when you travel around the country is now the Chinese are producing engineers and scientists, setting aside the contentious issue of stem cell research, but just generally speaking, a lot of money, mind you, a very small number relative to their entire society, but are entering into these fields. And often I hear concerns that we're going to be outdone on the engineering and higher science side. What is the role of higher education here, and who should be involved in financing higher education?
Again,
and what are our risks?
Again, I think higher education, as with lower education, it should be financed by the individuals who are benefiting from it, not by the government. You now have so-called private schools and public schools, government schools and private schools. All of them derive from the land grants of the 1860s.
We Texans know that, by the way.
In my opinion, you need more competition in the higher education area as you do in the lower education. And here again, if government's going to finance schooling, it should finance the consumers, not the producers. Here you have the state of Texas has the University of Texas. California has the University of California. It spends a great deal of money on sending children to those schools. That's the most redistributive activity of the government in total. What happens is that you send children to Berkeley at the expense of the residents of Watts, or you send the kid from Beverly Hills to school at the expense of the residents of Watts. And but if you're going to spend the money, what California should do, is it's going to spend X $1 billion on higher education. It should say, we're going to give out scholarships equal to so much per person for whatever number of students however much far our money will go. And they can use those scholarships in any university they want to, including Berkeley, but Berkeley will have to live on the tuition that it earns from the people it attracts. And the same thing in Texas. Instead of financing the University of Texas, in my opinion, the right way to do it would be to provide scholarships on an exam, if you want, to as many students as you can afford, and require the state universities to charge tuition, to enter into free competition, and to live on their earnings.
And yet we see
But let me add one more thing
Yes,
for a moment. We benefit from China having more skilled people. It's just that we don't benefit as much as we would if we also had more of our own skilled people. But why are we hurt in any way? Suppose China breeds a great many more engineers. That enables them to produce goods and services cheaper.
Right.
They'll sell them to us cheaper. Aren't we better off?
very good question. Even if they subsidize their education, because it's a centralized government, produce those engineers, say, cheaper than we might here. Your point is that we can take advantage of that. We may not be victimized. Is that correct?
Exactly.
An interesting perspective. So we shouldn't worry
And-
that others might be.
And basically, they're hurting themselves by doing that. If they're subsidizing something that is, it should not be subsidized.
I remember as a child being told over and over again that Soviet children were better at mathematics than I was. I remember what happened to the Soviet Union. And now I hear similar arguments being applied to China or to
Yeah.
other countries. I assume that you expect the outcome in China, as long as they keep moving towards more freedom, to obviously be different than that of what happened to the Soviet Union.
Oh, entirely. I think China is now headed, if it continues in its present course, sometime in the next 10 or 15 years, you're going to have a drastic change in the political structure. You cannot maintain, in my opinion, today's political structure and today's economic. I think you're already more than 50% private in the economy.
Let me ask you a summary question, if I may, because you've lived a long life. You've made major contributions to the way we think and the way we act. What do you worry about in terms of the future of America?
Well, I am basically innately an optimist, and so I have a great future for America. I think we have the right kind of a basic government if we can keep it. And what I worry about most for America is that we will not control the propensity to spend, for government spending, to increase, as we should do. If freedom is going to be lost in America, it will be lost by an excessive government involvement. You have it's hard to say, but it's true. We are much wealthier today than we were in 1950, but we are less free today than we were in 1950. If you think of all of the regulations that have been imposed in the period since then, of all of the organizations, Medicare, Medicaid, aid for disabled people, you can go down the line. There are hundreds of them. So that while there's less regulation on business, but there's more regulation on people. The prohibition of drugs, it was bad then, but it got worse when Nixon started a war on drugs in 1972. And but in any event, from the long run point of view, the only thing I am really worried about is that government will grow too large.
Well, we will hope that that is not the case, and we will.
Well, there's some reason for optimism. If you look at the record, if you look at a single measure, non-defense spending as a percentage of national. You start in 1950, right after World War II, and it goes like this to 1980. Then, with Reagan's election, a change in public opinion, it goes like horizontal. And today, the non-defense spending as a percentage of income is the same as it was in 1980. So we've slowed down,
Held the line.
galloping social, but we have not really defeated it yet.
Well, we'll hope that that ensues, and in the meantime, we'll continue to provide what central bankers do to your satisfaction.
Good.
Thank you very much.